It's episode 139 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. And there you can subscribe to the show. It would really help if you would click the subscribe button on your phone or your computer or however you listen to the podcast. I'd like to thank some sponsors this week. If you've had a chance to check out thirdscribe.com, but maybe not lately, do yourself a favor and go check it out. Rob and the guys over at thirdscribe.com have completely revamped it and made a beautiful, beautiful platform for connecting authors and readers. If you're an author and you need some help getting your work out there to readers, ThirdScribe can help. If you're a reader and you'd like to get closer to the books and the authors that you love, ThirdScribe can help. They're building a community that's bringing readers and writers together. What could be a more beautiful thing than that? Also, Crystal at Pico's house. If you're looking for an editor, Crystal is one of the very best. She got her start as a Hugh Howey beta reader. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, proofreading, everything that you need on the editing front. Crystal can do it for you. She's edited over 50 novels and novellas, 125 short stories, including 5 Future Chronicles anthologies, and she comes recommended by some of the very best-selling authors. If you mention Author Stories when booking your services, you can receive a $75 discount on manuscripts over 60,000 words in length or $25 on short stories. Please go check out Crystal at Pico's house and tell her that you heard about it on Author Stories.
Earth defeated the aliens once. Now they're back. After the devastating attack on Earth, the swarm fell back to regroup. Now, sooner than expected, they've returned to finish what they started, enslaving the human race. Samantha Avery, newly promoted captain of Avenger, has her hands full. A paid assassin seeking her death, a renegade officer working for the Swarm, and an enemy fleet bent on the destruction of the vital Wellington shipyards. As the Swarm launches a devastating attack against Britannia sector, Avery finds she must seek victory on multiple fronts. But Avery is a patriot for humanity. She's a dam standing tall against the alien flood. She is an Avenger.
On sale November 17th, Avenger from the world of Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet. Avenger by Chris Porteau is the follow-up to the David Bruns bestseller, Invincible. Pick up your copy today on Amazon.com. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, Mike Carey joins me on the podcast. I heard about Mike a while back as M.R. Carey, and his book, The Girl with All the Gifts, kind of had this underground buzz just kind of erupt around it many months ago, and I was really intrigued by it. And then I came to find out that M.R. Carey is the same as Mike Carey, who has written some of the most phenomenal comics and graphic novels that I have ever had the privilege of writing. So I reached out to Mike on Twitter, and he's so gracious to come on the show today. So thank you for joining me, Mike.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, Hank.
You're welcome. I begin each show with the same question for each of my guests, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Wow. I guess it would go a long way back for me. It feels like it was always something that was in my life. I can remember at school, whenever there was a writing assignment, I would try to turn it into a fiction assignment. No matter what the actual brief was, I would try to build a story into it. And then all through my teens, I was writing in school exercise books, which I would unashamedly purloin from my school. I would write these endless fantasy novels, loosely inspired by Lord of the Rings and then by the Michael Moorcock books and Mervyn Peake. They were written freehand in blue biro, and nobody ever got to see them. I still got a big stack of them in the back of a cupboard somewhere. And then in my 20s, I started to try to actually send stuff to publishers. So I can't remember when the first time was, but it would have been when I was very, very young.
It's just one of these things that's been ingrained in who you are.
Yeah, yeah. I think stories are kind of the most important thing in my life in many ways.
I've interviewed over 150 authors on the show now, and that is a very similar answer for so many. And it's one of the reasons that I begin with that question is because it uncovers something about who we are as storytellers. We all have that early memory that is just something about us that's maybe a little different, that just this thing needs to come out. Did you have anyone in your life that recognized that in you and that maybe encouraged encouraged you to pursue that?
I guess we were all kind of. I come from quite a large family. There were 5 of us, 5 siblings, and I had dozens of cousins who lived very close to me. It was in a very sort of blue-collar area of Liverpool. People didn't tend to move very far. They tended to settle like in the same street as their parents or a few streets over. So I was always sort of surrounded by this big clan of relatives. And I think we were all sort of like fairly passionate about stories. I remember learning to read literally on my mother's knee before I was ever sent to school, mostly from comic books. At that time, there was a great British comic book tradition. We had dozens and dozens of anthology comics for younger children and adventure comics for older kids. And I can remember sort of sitting on my mum's knee and sort of puzzling over how to spell ag and zap and wham and stuff. So yeah, my mum was certainly instrumental in it. She had very, very little formal education, but she had a crazy imagination. What she didn't know about the world, she filled in for herself. So as a young woman, she believed that the reason why there were hot countries and cooler countries was because every country had its own sun, and some of them were bigger.
I love it. You said that you were trying to figure out how to draw and spell the onomatopoeias that we see in comics a lot. Were comics instrumental in your upbringing?
Yeah, to a huge extent. I mean, I loved comics before I loved books. I guess because they were cheaper and more readily available. Books were kind of luxury items back in the early 60s. This was before the netbook agreement collapsed, so there was price control on books. It was illegal for bookshops to sell books at discount. Actually, it probably wasn't a legal thing. It was probably just an industry agreement. But books were very expensive. Comics were a couple of pennies. So yeah, I loved comics from a very, very young age. There were 2 great geniuses, great practitioners back then, Leo Baxendale and Ken Reed. And although none of their stuff was credited to them, you didn't get to put your name on a comic book in those days. I recognized their styles and I loved their work, and I got really excited and really immersed in their comics. And then at a certain point, I guess I would have been about 6 years old, 7 years old, my older brother gave me a Fantastic Four annual that he'd finished reading. It's the annual in which Reed Richards is trapped in the negative zone and Triton of the Inhumans goes in to rescue him. And that was the first American comic book I ever read. And it was like, where have you been all my life? It was just so wonderful, so thrilling and exhilarating. And then I sort of got the bug for superhero books, which then dominated my reading for many years.
Oh, what was it that was different about American comics as opposed to some of them that were more readily available to you in Liverpool?
I think that the difference is that they were more highly colored, and that was both literally true and metaphorically true, because British comic books at the time were printed very, very cheaply on newsprint paper, and they would either be completely black and white, or they'd have a couple of pages of what was called spot color.
Right.
Where you'd have black, white, and then you'd have a third color sort of layered in for certain details, like black, white, and red on one page, or black, white, and green on another page. But you never had full process color. and American comic books you did, but also they were just like crazily imaginative. They had genres that we didn't have. We didn't really have superheroes over here. There were, a little bit later in my childhood, there were attempts to do British equivalents of the American superhero books. So we had characters like the Steel Claw, who was a man with a steel hand, and if he plugged his hand into an electric socket, he became invisible except for the hand. Health and safety nightmare. And there was Kelly's Eye, which was a guy who had an amulet that made him invulnerable to harm, so long as he was wearing it. But really, those sort of great classic superhero sci-fi epics that Stan Lee was writing in the 60s, we had no equivalent of that. And they were epics. They were huge stories, often told over many, many issues, and you would frantically try to collect all those issues to fill in all the gaps in the story. My friend Rose Cavaney, who writes reviews for Time Out, says that American superhero books are, if you take them collectively, the single biggest mythological text that the human race has ever produced. And I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, I think in a postmodern world, if you want to use that sort of language, they are our myths and our. I mean, look at how comic books and superheroes have come into the mainstream and into pop culture. Now we talk about Captain America and Iron Man and Thor and Hulk and these like they're religious figures. It's really interesting the level of saturation that we've gotten and how the most unlikely people can tell you at least part of these characters' backstories and things. It's really something.
And what fascinates me also in that is how they reflect what else is happening in culture and in society. Peter Gross, who was my collaborator on Lucifer and on the Unwritten, points out that really superheroes in American comics kind of function as a metaphor for America, for how America sees itself in the world. So you have the Silver Age, when Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way. When superheroes don't kill, they have a strict moral code, and it's absolute. It's death to your reputation if you veer from that code. And that was very much a sort of reflection of America's self-professed status at the time as the world's guardian, the world's policeman. And then when you have Watergate and you have Vietnam, superheroes veer into a sort of darker and more cynical mold with things like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. At every stage, there's kind of a mirroring of the way we view ourselves in the way our superheroes behave.
Yeah. How did you get a hold of American comics? Were they were there bookstores that carried them, or what was your manner for getting a hold of them?
I didn't know this at the time, but I was incredibly fortunate to live in Liverpool, which was a port city. American comics were available in Liverpool because they would come across the Atlantic as ballast. There would be sort of huge parcels of them thrown into the bottom of the hold of the ships to function as ballast. So they were readily available in Liverpool at a time when they were very hard to find elsewhere in the UK. And you'd buy them in newsagents. Each newsagent would have what we call a spinner rack, which was a vertical shelving unit with sort of little wire pouches.
Oh yeah.
And they would be changed regularly, or rather they'd be added to regularly. Each week there would be new ones put in there, and you would go in and sort through what there was. And it was never the same thing twice. You'd go in one week and there would be mainly Marvel. Right. Another week it would be DC, or it would be Dell, or Gold Key, or Atlas, and you just took whatever you could find.
I've heard Grant Morrison tell a very similar story that because of the American naval Navy being stationed close to where he grew up, that he was able to get American comics that way. So maybe America has exported something good with our military.
It certainly sort of furnished, the inside of my brain as a kid. Those books were so instrumental in who I became,
Right.
as a creator. My love for fantasy, sci-fi, horror, for all of those sort of what we call speculative fiction now. It all had its origin in those early sort of adventures with American comic books.
Right. When you were grown and you decided, okay, I'm going to try my hand at being a writer myself, and you said that in your 20s you started sending out some things to try to get published. What were those things that you were writing?
They were overwhelmingly science fiction, because at the time that was mostly what I was reading and enjoying, and that was what I wanted to be as a science fiction writer. They were, it has to be said, they were very, very poorly structured. They were big, sprawling, shapeless bags of story, because I didn't know anything about structure. I hadn't figured structure out. So I would start writing with minimal planning. I have an idea for a MacGuffin for a story, and I just launch right in without having any idea where I was going, and then just keep on adding and adding and adding until I got to something that looked like the end. So they were huge, and they were completely shapeless. And I would send them out to publishers, and I would get polite letters back saying, "You should try writing this as a novel." Because they really weren't. They were sort of inchoate proto things. And then I started writing reviews and articles for fanzines, for sort of amateur free magazines. And through that, I came to meet some people who were actually making comic books. And I started pitching to editors. And I got into actually sort of getting my work published in those forums first, which turned out to be a great way to learn how to tell a story. Because with comics, because the canvas is of a very limited size and a fixed size, you have X pages, and you've got to tell your story in that many pages, no more, no less. So you have to think about structure. You have to make conscious decisions about structure and pacing. So basically, I learned how to do what I should have been doing all along, which was to think about the shape of the story and think about where the story was going, and what were the key beats along the way.
Comics also teaches you to think in a very unique way, in that when you get to the end of a page, that last panel, you need to have a leader that goes. You kind of leave with a very small cliffhanger, and to make you turn the page, and then it leads into something. And there's a very unique structure in that that is kind of in no other form of literature. But I could see where learning those little tricks would help in novel writing to keep the reader engaged and to keep them turning the pages. Yeah,
no, I think that's very definitely true. And if you look at Girl with All the Gifts in particular, it's written in a very, I don't know, almost a telegraphic way. Each chapter builds to either a little reveal or a little emotional nugget, a sort of a significant moment, and it always leaves you on a sort of dramatic beat, which is encouraging you, enticing you to read the next chapter and see where that goes.
Right.
And I guess that does come from comics.
Yeah, I honestly, when I first read The Girl with All the Gifts, I didn't realize that this was the same person as you, and I was thinking, wow, this very much reads like a comic. I bet this M.R. Carey is involved in comics somehow, and well, there you go. That's fantastic.
The pseudonym was not my idea; it was my publisher's idea.
So what was the first comic that you got involved writing?
It would have been Aquarius. So very briefly, in 1990 and 1991, there was a British comic book called Toxic, It lasted for exactly 31 issues. And it was an attempt by a very small publishing company, Apocalypse Press, to create a rival to 2000 AD. At that point, 2000 AD had been going for about, 15, 20 years and was extremely successful. It gave us Judge Dredd, it gave us Rogue Trooper, a whole bunch of sort of like really great sci-fi series. So this other publishing house was trying to do the same thing, but they got their numbers wrong and they got into financial trouble very quickly. So I pitched 2 stories to them, and they published one of them. It was called Aquarius, and it was, looking back at it now, it was shamelessly plagiaristic of Watchmen. It was so heavily based on Watchmen. It was like me doing a superhero book with a sort of post-Watchmen aesthetic vibe to it, but really very, very, very much indebted, not very original at all. And they published two episodes of it, and then they went bankrupt. So it's in the last 2 issues of the comic.
Wow. 91, that was a really interesting time in comics. There was kind of this resurgence, and before the big bust, there was a huge boom. What was that like writing during that time period?
It was a wonderful time. It felt like a renaissance. I can remember
there were rock stars being made. Comic writers. Yeah.
I can remember coming back from Liverpool to London on a coach, on a bus, and reading. I had a couple of issues of Watchmen with me, and I had the first issue of Dark Knight, and I was thinking, this is extraordinary. This is the new golden age.
Mm-hmm.
When I started writing, there were 3 sort of great precursors who I drew on directly, was directly inspired by, and who I imitated to one extent or another before I found my own voice. And they were Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and most of all, Neil Gaiman.
Mm.
Three British writers who went across to America and I think redefined between them what you could do in long-form storytelling in a comic, creating these new templates, which I think we're still indebted to today.
Oh, absolutely. And you've got guys like me who grew up in the 70s and 80s and got away from comics as we grew up. And then in the 90s, as we were coming into adulthood, seeing these guys like Gaiman and Morrison and more redefining what storytelling could be and what it could mean to those of us coming into adulthood. That was a gift to our generation for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I made the same journey somewhat earlier, and the guy who brought me back into comics after I discovered sort of girls and alcohol and stuff was Chris Claremont.
Yes.
In his first run on X-Men.
X-Men, right.
And that was, in its time, which I guess we're talking sort of like late 70s, early 80s, that was a new template. That was doing stuff that hadn't been done before. Claremont was, I think, the first person really to sort of to write superhero stories as though they were a soap opera. He would set up plots and he would intertwine them over years and years, and there were always 3 or 4 things happening at a time. And sometimes he would set something up and not pay it off for like 3, 4, 5 storylines.
Right.
And that was that was something that felt new and fresh and exciting. It hasn't aged well because it depended very heavily on narrative captions, on sort of explicit narrative captions. Claremont had this trick which at the time passed without comment, but now looks kind of incredibly quaint, which is he'd have the captions argue with the characters.
Right.
There was an episode in which Wolverine brings flowers to Jean Grey's bedside after she crashes into Manhattan Bay and becomes the Phoenix. So we're talking about issue 101, 102 of Uncanny. He brings the flowers in and finds that all of the X-Men are there before him. So he's thinking what the Wolverine wants, the Wolverine gets, and the caption says, "Not this time, bub."
funny. Yeah, I don't know that you could get away with that nowadays.
No, I don't think so.
But it's really funny, really funny. Uh, wow. So that first comic run you had was ill-fated, but I assume you got bitten by the bug enough that you definitely did not give up.
That's absolutely right. And I had incredible good fortune. The artist on that first comic was Ken Meyer Jr., an American artist working in Britain. And he was friends with Dave Dorman and Dave's wife, Lorene Haynes, who at the time were thinking about setting up an agency for comic creators, repping comic creators to publishers. I think that it was going to be called Big Time. And I don't think they ever actually went ahead and did it, but but Ken introduced me to Lorene, and Lorene said, well, yeah, I'll rep you a bit. I won't take any money because I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'll rep you and see if I can get you any gigs with American publishers. And so just basically out of the kindness of her huge heart, she shopped my stuff around to Malibu and then to Caliber, and got me a whole bunch of little gigs, short-lived projects that just gave me a toehold in the American market. I'm internally indebted to both her and Ken for that. So I worked for Malibu. Malibu at that time had an imprint called Rocket Comics, which was stories about rock stars. So Lorene got me a gig writing an Ozzy Osbourne comic book, and then a Pantera comic book starring the Texan heavy metalers, Pantera.
Dimebag Darrell and crew.
Yep, exactly. And it was a story that Phil Anselmo had come up with himself, and I wrote it from his little thumbnail. It involved the Pantera fighting a bunch of vampires and beating them. And then I worked for Caliber, and I did a whole bunch of stuff at Caliber, and I met Mike Perkins, another of my favorite artists, and sort of gradually sort of worked my way around the American indie scene, and everything that I got published, I would send to Vertigo, because there was the time when Vertigo was kind of like the sort of big indie voice in comics. Obviously not indie in a strict sense, because it was a subdivision of DC, but they were doing all these incredible things. They were moving away from the superhero genre, doing fantasy comics and horror comics and science fiction comics. So I was sending all my stuff to them with begging letters, saying, please let me work for you. And then Elisa Whitney, who was the editor on Sandman at the time, wrote back to me and offered me some work.
And what work was that?
Well, she invited me to try out for The Dreaming, which was the first of many, many sequels to The Sandman. And I pitched a whole bunch of ideas for The Dreaming, none of which were accepted. And then The Dreaming became a continuity book written by Caitlin Keenan, and so that window closed. I was still writing for Caliber at the time. I did a book called Inferno for them, and then I did Dr. Faustus with Mike Perkins, and I was still sending the stuff to Vertigo, to Elisa, and when I wasn't, Mike was. And then out of the blue, she called me up and said, look, we're going to do another Sandman sequel called Sandman Presents. Short arcs, like 3-4 issue stories, focusing on supporting characters from the Sandman universe. Would you like to write one? We're going to start with Lucifer, but we would need you to jump on it like immediately. And what I didn't know at the time, but learned subsequently, was that they had already commissioned the story from another writer, but for whatever reason they hadn't accepted the script when it came in. So they'd already, I think they may even have already advertised it, but certainly they had the publishing slot all sorted, and they had Scott Hampton standing ready to paint it. So they needed a script, and she gave me a chance, and I jumped at it. So Sandman Presents Lucifer was my first DC comic.
Wow. And so what I'm hearing from you is that you always had your eye on Vertigo. That was a goal of yours, and especially if guys like you named as your influences and sort of heroes in the business, that's where they were being published, over at Vertigo.
Yeah.
So that's a goal of yours, but you kept taking work wherever you could find it, and kept building your portfolio, and kept submitting to Vertigo, but while honing your chops all along the way.
Yes, that's exactly it. And often it felt like I was taking one step forward and seven steps back.
Right.
But when you say honing your craft, that's exactly what it was. I was learning how to do it so that when the opportunity came, when the ball dropped into my arms, I could run with it.
Right. I think so many times we see an author that just burst onto the scene, and we look at that as overnight success and all of this sort of stuff, but that rarely is the case. Most of the time, it's guys that are grinding in the background, learning the craft, earning those dues, and just never giving up. I think that never giving up amounts more than probably raw God-given talent.
Yeah, that was certainly the case for me. And looking back now, none of that stuff was wasted. Although at the time, I would get really discouraged when I picked up a gig and then the publisher went out of business, or for whatever reason I would pitch and it would be bounced back at me. I built up this colossal pile of rejection letters, just as every author does, and I kept thinking I was getting nowhere, but I wasn't. I was sort of positioning myself, I guess, so that I could make the end run.
Yeah. So what was it like getting to work in the Sandman universe? I mean, that's such an iconic book, such a genre definer, almost rule breaking. What was when you actually landed the gig? What was the weight of that like?
It was just wonderful. It was it was literally my dream job. As in, I had dreamed of it. I had fantasized about writing stories with Sandman characters in them. It was my favorite comic at the time. I felt that it had shattered the mold, and I still think it shattered the mold. What Neil did in those 75 issues was absolutely extraordinary. Writing a story which is at one and the same time incredibly focused and directional and incredibly picaresque. There are so many different side narratives that weave in and out of the main narrative and enrich it, and then turn out to be relevant in completely unexpected ways, so that you get to an ending that is both astonishing, surprising, and absolutely inevitable. You just realize that everything has been set up. And it's very rare that you have something that can do that. I think Lock and Key, the Joe Hill Lock and Key, is a more recent example of a comic that I think does that. So I was so ecstatic and excited about getting the opportunity to write in the Sandman universe that I almost forgot to be scared. It was a huge responsibility, and big shoes to fill. Very easy to fail. And in some senses we did fail. We never got anything like the audience that Sandman did, but I think we did build up a very faithful following, and we got to tell the story that we wanted to tell.
Yeah.
But Vertigo has always been, I think, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it's always been a writer's imprint, a writer-friendly imprint.
Yeah.
And writers are allowed to lead the project. So we told the story that we wanted, and when we finished, DC respected the fact that we were finished and ended the book. And I'm sort of enormously proud of what we did. It was a life-changing experience. I can remember having a conversation with Neil very early on when I was pitching the monthly, and he said, "You can't know from the outside what a weird mix of meticulous planning and serendipity writing a monthly book is. You can only learn it by doing it." And I said, "But yeah, you're not telling me that anything about Sandman was unplanned. It was so beautifully, intricately plotted." And he said, "Yeah, well, it was, but and I always knew where I was going, but there were some things that just happened because they happened, because I just hit on a great idea and built it in. And that was what it was like writing Lucifer as well. There were all sorts of things that we knew where we would end, that there would be a second war in heaven, that Lucifer would be fighting on the side of the angels, that we'd end up with a different power in hell and a different power in the Silver City. But we didn't know exactly what journey we were going to take. We didn't know what the stops along the way were all going to be. And it was a wonderful journey. And of course it introduced me to Peter Gross, my longest running collaborator and one of my best friends in the industry. Yeah. One of my best friends, full stop.
And what a phenomenal run on that comic that it was. How did you then transition over to Constantine Hellblazer?
I was offered Hellblazer. I must have been about 3 years in to Lucifer, and I'd given up my day job at that point. I was a teacher for 15 years, but I resigned in 1999, 2000, that academic year. And I was writing Lucifer, so Lucifer was all I was doing. And then Will Dennis, who was the editor on Hellblazer, called me and offered me Hellblazer. And I said, "Oh, I'm very flattered, but no thank you. I'm already writing a comic." It didn't seem possible to me at the time that you could write two comics side by side, ironically, given that a few years later I was writing 4 or 5 at the time. Right. But I said no, because I thought Lucifer was a full-time job. And Will Dennis said, "Okay, well, look, I'm not going to take your first answer. I'm going to put the phone down now, and I'm going to wait for you to change your mind." And it took about a day, and I called him up and said, "Yeah, I've changed my mind." Yeah. He said, "Okay, cool. Tell us what you do. Just give us a thumbnail pitch for where you would take the character." And again, as it's Sandman, I've been reading Hellblazer since before there was a Hellblazer. I read Constantine when he was a supporting character in Swamp Thing. I'd been there for the whole of his journey. Right. And also, in a weird way, I had lived parts of his journey, not the magical parts, but the being a Liverpudlian living in the southeast of England, a Liverpudlian living in London. I think that was exactly my situation at the time. So when I wrote Hellblazer, I just gave John a lot of my own past. I had him sort of living in places I'd lived in and drinking in the pubs that I used to drink in and so
on. Love it. A friend of mine, Kevin G. Summers, who's also a writer, mentioned your comic, The Unwritten, to me a while back, and this is what he told me about it. He said I've been a lifelong comics fan, but in one of the big reshufflings that DC Comics did, the New 52, he said I just got really disillusioned with the whole thing and kind of vowed to not read comics anymore. He said, and then I found Mike Carey's The Unwritten, and he said it completely redeemed the art form for me.
Wow.
Yeah, and then he went on to describe this book to me in terms that were nearly evangelical, and he then credited one of his books, which is a very popular book called The Legendarium, and he said if it were not for Mike Carey's Unwritten, I would have never been able to write this other book. It was that transformational for me.
That's an amazing thing to hear.
Oh, it's so then I went and picked it up, and I can only agree with him. But where did that book come from?
It came from, initially the impetus for it came from my desire to work with Peter again and his desire to work with me again. When we finished on Lucifer, we just didn't want it to end. It had been a great partnership, right? And we both felt that we did our best work when we were together, when we were striking sparks off each other. So we in the last year of the Lucifer run, we pitched, I'm going to say dozens, I think it was dozens, of rough ideas to Shelley Bond, our then editor. And none of them would take root for some reason. We came very close with a series called Dead Easy, but it got greenlit, and then somehow the green light turned into a red light again before we could start. And we got discouraged, and Peter went away and did American Jesus with Mark Miller, and I went and had my adventures at Marvel, writing Fantastic Four and X-Men. But then we were at a San Diego Comic-Con together. I'm not going to be able to tell you which one it was, what year it was, but Pornsak Pichetshote, the Vertigo editor, was also there, and the three of us hung out a lot. And we started just brainstorming ideas. And Peter had an idea for a parallel lives story, telling the story of a young girl, telling her real life, but also telling her fictional adventures as told by her father. And I had the idea of a guy who finds the magic trumpet, which in Hindu mythology signals the end of one age of the earth and the beginning of the next age, the next yuga. And we were just sort of bouncing these ideas off each other, and Pornsak said, "Why don't you put them together? Could they not be parts of the same idea?" And we looked at each other and thought, yeah, maybe they could. So after we got back to our various houses, me in London and Peter in Minnesota, we kept on talking, we kept on working it up, and we came up with a pitch. And Pornsak tells this story in the introduction to the new deluxe edition of the Unwritten. We pitched it to him. We sent him the pitch, and then we live pitched it as well. We called him, had a conference call, and told him the idea, and we were full of enthusiasm. And he was like, I just don't get this. I don't see what it's about. I don't see why it's exciting or interesting. We completely failed to get the idea across. And we came away from that phone call quite discouraged. But then we tried again. We put the words together in a different order, and he got it, and he commissioned it, and that's how it came together. I mean, I guess the other ingredient in the mix was I was reading The Enchanted Places, which is the autobiography of Christopher Milne, who was the son of A.A. Milne.
Right.
The son of the guy who wrote the Winnie the Pooh stories. And I was struck by how he, as a child, had this terrible experience of being famous as a fictional character, famous as somebody else's creation, right, and how long it had taken him to get over that. And so that definitely fed into the way we portray Tom's story in the Unwritten.
How many issues did that go for?
About 72, perhaps. Maybe even a little bit more. No, I think 72.
Yeah.
If you count in we had the 0.5 issues.
Gotcha.
And then we also had a little graphic novel on the side, Ship That Sank Twice.
Right.
So almost the same length as Lucifer.
Yeah. I do want to get over to your prose writing and The Girl with All the Gifts in just a moment, but you mentioned that you did some time over at Marvel with X-Men and Fantastic Four. Fantastic Four was one of your first introductions to American comics. What was that like, getting to dip your foot over into that universe for a little while?
It was really enjoyable. It was just purely fun, really. I've described it as like building rooms in a house that you used to live in as a child.
That's a great way.
You're adding to this great mythology that had meant so much to me as a reader. It was a wonderful experience. Actually, I'll give you an example from X-Men rather than Fantastic Four. In my first X-Men arc, I created a new group of bad guys called the Children of the Vault. And about maybe 2-3 weeks later, someone sent me a link to a Wikipedia page, and there was an entry on the Children of the Vault, which described what I'd created in that issue. I thought, my God, I'm in canon. I'm canonical.
Oh wow!
And it just thrilled me to sort of be able to do that.
Yeah,
I still think it was a wonderful privilege.
Well, yeah, and it's such an interesting art form that we have such a massive mythology, like we talked about earlier, but it's still growing, and all of these other creators keep coming in and molding and shaping and adding little nuggets here and there that then make the whole, this entirely other thing. It's really incredible.
It is, yeah. It's a wonderfully collaborative medium in that respect. Everybody's sort of throwing ingredients into a big soup. That's Neil Gaiman's image, not mine, but I think it's an apt one.
Yeah.
You're all chucking something into the stew, and the stew just keeps on getting richer and richer.
Right. So all this time you're writing comics, but you're also dabbling in your long form novel writing along the way, aren't you? What got you kind of shifted back over to that gear, and how did you get started?
It was something I'd always wanted to do. As I was saying earlier, in my teens and 20s, that was what I was writing. It was mostly prose, not comics. So I always had a sort of, at the back of my mind, the plan of going back into prose. And by this time, I had acquired an agent, Meg Davis, and Meg introduced me to Darren Nash, who was an editor at Simon & Schuster. Simon & Schuster at that time had a dedicated science fiction list called Earthlight, and Darren was the editor on that. And I was pitching stuff to Darren, but then they closed out the Earthlight list. Darren was briefly out of work before moving to Little Brown / Orion. And I pitched him what became the Felix Castor novels. I pitched him an idea for like stories about an exorcist in a London that has ghosts and zombies and were creatures and so on. And he's an exorcist in a sort of Raymond Chandler mold. He's an exorcist in a trench coat who walks the mean streets, does it for $50 a day plus expenses. Sorry, 50 quid a day plus expenses. Night without armor in a savage land kind of thing. And he commissioned it. He commissioned 3 books. I ended up writing 5, and hopefully I'll write a 6th. Actually, I've had the idea for the 6th in my mind for a long time. So yeah, Felix Castor was my sort of entry back into prose, and it has to be said, it happened largely because of Hellblazer, because there's a big overlap between Felix and John.
So again, it's the daily work and the constant adding to your repertoire that you just never know what piece is going to be the piece that stacks up to reach the goal that you're looking for. It's amazing.
It is amazing, yeah. And of course, coming back to prose from comics, I suddenly found, I had what I hadn't had before. I had the skill set. I was able to write a 120,000 word book and not get lost in the intricacies.
Right.
I was able to sort of keep the plot together, to pace out the beats, to keep keep the story moving forward. And I got drunk on the freedom, because of course the difference is the canvas now is not 22 pages; it's however many pages you want it to be. If you want to sort of take 3 chapters and send your main character to Birmingham, in Birmingham in the U.S., which I did in the 3rd Castor novel, you can do that. Nobody can tell you no.
Love it. Where did The Girl with All the Gifts come from? When I first started hearing about it, the things I heard were this is completely genre busting. It's not what you think it is. Don't dismiss this book because of this one trope that you may or may not like. It's completely not that thing. It's completely this other thing masquerading as this thing. Where did that story come from?
It came from being pushed way outside my comfort zone. I'd been approached by Charlene Harris and Tony Kellner with a very kind invitation to write a story for one of their anthologies, and I knew about these anthologies, and I'd read a couple of them. They were doing them every year at that time, and the theme was always something incredibly innocuous and everyday. Like one year it was home improvement, and another year it was family vacations. But you have the brief is to write a supernatural story or a horror story, dark fantasy story around that theme. And so I said I would do something, and the theme for that year was school days. And I sat for months. I mean, obviously I was working on other things, but whenever I thought about, what am I going to do for that school story, all I could come up with were really bad rip-offs of Harry Potter. And I was starting to panic because the deadline was coming due. And then I woke up one morning with the idea of Melanie in my mind, the idea of a little girl, sweet, innocent, engaging little girl, sitting in a classroom, writing the essay that everybody writes somewhere in their school careers, which is what I want to be when I grow up. Only we can see, and she can't, that she's not going to grow up because she's a zombie. So that was the opening sort of image that came into my mind, and the original working title was When I Grow Up, or When I Get Big. And I wrote the story in 4 days. And the story was about the little girl and her relationship with her teacher, and also her relationship with the soldier who guards the children at the base, who is Sergeant Parks in the novel. Sent the story in, and then it was well received. It was nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award and a Derringer Award. But I was convinced that there was more to the character and more to the world. I couldn't put Melanie out of my mind. I kept on thinking about, where would you go from there? If the story didn't end there, what would you do with it? And I took it to my then editor, Anne Clark, of Little Brown, and I said, okay, I'm meant to be writing a completely different novel for you, but I want to write this. I want to turn this short story into a novel. So could you let me out of the contract that I'm in so that I can do this? And Anne said, well, that's going to be really difficult to do because the contract was with my old agency, MBA, but I'd followed my actual agent, Meg, to a new company that she'd founded. So I was effectively asking Anne to go back to the old agency to unpick a contract under which they would have got some money in order to replace it with a contract under which they wouldn't get a penny because it would be a contract with the new agency.
Right.
Which in the end is what we did.
Wow.
We found a way of doing it that didn't sort of that wasn't unfair to anyone, that didn't disadvantage anyone. And I got to write it, and it was an incredibly seamless process. It was one of the easiest novels to write, really, of anything that I've done. It just seemed to sort of pour out of me. And the first draft was almost the last draft. There were very, very few amendments to it. So a really easy process.
What do you attribute that to?
I think it's because the character was so vivid. Everything it stands or falls by Melanie. Everything that matters is to do with her. Although there are 4 other point of view characters in the book. Caldwell, Justineau, Parks, and Gallagher. What matters in each case is their relationship with her, how she sees her, and how she sees them, and how they see her, and how their view of her changes through the story, and how far they're able to get past the fact of what she is and see her as a real human being. It was easy because I knew exactly who they all were. I think going in, and therefore I knew what had to happen to sort of let the logic of those relationships play out.
Yeah, sometimes when you're writing, it feels like you are sort of a kid on the beach, and you've got a pail and a spade, and you're kind of digging the story up as you go, and there's some work involved, and you're having to push things out of the way so that you can discover what lies beneath. And some days it feels like you're a reporter who's standing on a street corner, and you're just watching it unfold, and you're just writing down what happens. Did it feel like that the second scenario for you in this book? Yeah, it did. It felt like I was sort of bringing out something that was already there, and so it was much less effort than it usually is. And I just finished writing the prequel, the Boy on the Bridge, a completely different set of characters, but a very, very similar storytelling technique, similar approach, the multiple point of view, present tense. And that was equally enjoyable and almost equally straightforward as a process. Yeah. Is that book out yet?
No, it comes out next May.
Okay, wonderful. I was hoping I had not missed it. That's wonderful. So that's going to be your next next project published?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Great. If anyone listening out there has not read The Girl with All the Gifts, I listened to the audiobook just a while back, and it is phenomenal, just amazing. So if you're into audiobooks, that's a great one to pick up for sure. And we'll look forward to reading the prequel. I can't wait to see what you did with that. Mike, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to come on the show. I could talk with you all day. We've got so much that I feel like we barely scratched the surface on, but thank you so much for your time.
Great pleasure, Hank. It was really good to talk.
You too. Where can people find you to follow all your work? I'll put links to your Amazon page, of course, but can people follow you on Twitter, or do you have a website?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I do have a website, but I never go there. To my eternal shame. So it's best to friend me on Facebook or follow me on Twitter. I'm always on those places.
Great. Thank you, Mike, so much for everything that you do. I appreciate it. I'm a huge fan, and so happy that you came on the show today.
Thanks, Hank. I had a great time. Cheers.
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast. Find all of the episodes at hankgarner.com. Thanks for listening.